Now that we've got our whole body rigged up, let's start taking a look at facial rigging. Now, because faces are so expressive and capable of so many different types of movement, facial rigging can get very, very complicated very quickly. In this course, we're going to focus on some basics to get you started. But even with just the basics that we cover in this course, you're going to be able to get a really wide range of expressive movement in your characters' faces. In this first lesson, we're going to begin our look at rigging eyes. And we're going to start with the simplest kind of eyes that you might encounter with 2D characters, which is just simple dot or button eyes. In other words, basically just pupils without eye whites or separate eyelids. This is a pretty common occurrence in 2D character design, and it also gives us a chance to focus on some of the real basics of eye rigging before we move on to something a little more complicated, which we'll do in the next lesson. So we're going to be working with our farmer man rig here, and you can see that we've got his body fully rigged up. Arms, legs, and torso are all ready to go. Now, as we talked about in the torso rigging lesson, we've got the head pre-composed into one layer here. And within this head pre-comp, we've got all the different elements that make up the face, including the separate left and right eyes. In most cases, this is the best way to work for facial rigging, and it's what I recommend except in very unusual cases. Note that we've pre-composed and cropped this layer to be more efficient. If you need a reminder on how to do that, make sure and review our lesson on pre-comping and cropping in Chapter 2. Now, one of the first things we want to do with an eye control is have a way that we can aim the eyes so the character can look where we want him or her to look. The sightline of a character, where a character is looking, is extremely important to let us know what the character is thinking about. Making sure a character isn't just always staring off blankly into space really helps a character seem alive and thinking and conscious. So we want to make sure we have that ability to aim the eyes so it can look up or down or left or right or at an object or at something in the character's hand or at another character or whatever you need. So we're going to start here by creating a basic aim control for our eyes. Now, with a character without eye whites and separate pupils, we're really just talking about moving the dot eyes around on the face. But the principle is exactly the same. So let's start by going to our Create Controllers tab, and I'm going to create a position-only control. Now, there is a little eye icon controller. If you want to use that, go ahead and do so. But I like the little position control. Kind of goes with my other central torso and head controllers here. So I'm going to go ahead and create that controller without anything selected. And I'm going to position that controller out in front of the face. And I'm going to line the Y value basically right along where the eyes are positioned right now. And we'll just put this a little ways out from the head so it's comfortably away from the rest of the rig. Now this will be our eye aim control, and we'll control where the character is looking. So let's move this controller down with our other centrally located controllers here. We'll keep it green, and we will call it eyes. Again, you can call it whatever you like. I'm going to call it eyes. And we're going to turn the opacity down. I'm okay with the size. I think the size is working pretty good. Now we want the eye controller to move whenever we move the head. So we're going to parent the eye controller to the head controller. And then right away we're going to zero out its position value. We always want our neutral values to be 0 whenever possible. Now let's go into our head comp and get our eyes set up so they can be controlled by the eye controller. Now we're going to take a few extra steps here that may not make any sense right away, but by the end of this lesson, you'll see why we're going to take these additional steps. We're going to continue adding controls to these eyes until we have a really nice, robust control over them. So we want to make sure and take some preliminary steps that will allow us to add those additional controls. So let's start by zooming in on the eyes themselves. We're going to select each eye in turn, and we're going to grab the pan behind tool, and we're going to move the anchor points of the eyes down towards the bottom of the eye, not all the way down, but sort of down in the bottom quarter roughly, or fifth or so of the eye. Now once you see later in the lesson why we're doing this, you can experiment with different positions on the eyeball, and I'm actually going to just maybe raise this up just a tad. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with the right eye. We want to put that anchor point in about the same position. Now that we've repositioned these anchor points, we're going to once again select each eye in turn and go to the Create Controllers tab, and we're going to create a null object at each eye. I'm going to move these null controllers above each little eye there, and we're going to parent each piece of eye artwork to its corresponding controller. Now again, this may seem kind of extraneous at this point, but later on you'll see why we're adding these nulls before we move forward. Now the next thing we want to do is deselect all of our layers here and create yet another null object inside this pre-comp. And we're going to call this null object eye control. Let's move that down above the eye artwork and the eye nulls we just created. And then let's hit the P key for position, and let's just zero out the position of this null. We don't need to use the zero out script. It's fine just to type in 0. That'll just put the null up here in the corner. That's just fine. Doesn't really matter where this null is. We want its position value at 0, but we don't need to preserve its position within the pre-comp here. Now that we've zeroed out the position of that controller null, let's grab our individual eye controller nulls and parent those to this eye control null. Now, of course, this eye control null is controlling the position of our eyes on the face. Now what we need to do is connect the position of this eye control null to our eye aim control here in this main rig comp. Now Duik does have a parent across comps script, which can be very, very useful, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than what we need here. And as you'll see in a minute, I like to muck around a little bit with the expressions we're going to create when we connect these together. So it makes it a little bit easier to do this manually rather than using parenting across comps. Not that you won't find some great uses for this, but in this case, doing it manually is a little more straightforward. So what we need to do is split our timeline because we need to connect these things across compositions. So I'm going to grab the head comp and I'm going to click and drag it down until we see the purple highlight here at the bottom of our timeline window, and I'm going to let go, and that'll give us 2 timeline windows. Now we can see both our eye and eye control elements, and we can see our main rig comp, and most importantly our eye aim control right here. So all we need to do now is grab our property pick whip, and again, if you're using CC 2018 or higher, you'll be able to just use this simple property pick whip. If you're using a version older than that, you'll need to option click on the stopwatch and use the expression pick whip. But we can just grab the property pick whip, click and drag up, and select the position value of our eye aim control. Remember, we zeroed that out as well, so we're just connecting 0 to 0 value. Now this works to connect these up, but it's going to cause a little issue that we need to solve. So let's take a look. If I go into this rig comp now, and I click and drag on the eyes, whoa, look at that. They kind of just fly around. It's actually really hard to control this, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio with the movement of the eye aim control and the movement of the eye controller. But that's a little too harsh and a little too difficult to control. So what we want to do is tune this control a little bit so the movement isn't so harsh and it makes it more intuitive to work with. So we're going to come down here into the head comp, and I'm going to pull this in a little to give me a little bit more room here in the timeline. I can shrink this down a little bit as well. And we're going to open up the expression tab here on our position value so we can see the expression code that's been written there. Now, in order to tune this, we want to make sure that when we move the eye aim control, we want this eye control null to move less. So what we need to do is just add some very, very simple math to this very basic expression. Right now, whatever numeric value we put into this position value is going to be reflected exactly here. So what we want to do is divide those numbers down. So we take whatever this value is and divide it by a number, so the resulting value is less. So you can always add math to an expression code. So we're going to select this expression code. We're going to go right to the end here. And I could type in a plus or a minus. If I wanted to multiply, I would type in an asterisk. But we want to divide by, and to divide by, we use the forward slash. So forward slash means divided by. So what we're saying is take this value from the rig comp, the eye layer, take this position value, and divide it by, let's say, 4. I'm guessing that's going to work pretty well. So we're making it a quarter of the value of the controller. Now let's go back into our rig comp here and try it out and see how that feels. Okay, that feels a lot better. It's a much, much more intuitive movement here because moving this eye aim control only moves these eyes a quarter of the value. That feels pretty good. Now, you can divide it by more or less if you want. It's entirely up to you. So I recommend you play around with this a little bit. See what feels the most intuitive to you. Okay, we've got a nice aim control here for our eyes, so our eyes can look up and down and around, and that's working pretty nice. But if you want really full expressive capability with your character, it's nice to also have individual control over each eye position. So for example, your character can be cross-eyed or have crazy googly eyes after getting hit on the head or something like that. So we can do this really simply by adding some point controllers to our eye control here. So let's close this up to make a little room. So with this eye control selected, let's go up under Effect, go down to Expression Controls, and add a point controller. Let's call this point controller right eye, and let's zero out its values. And then we can just go ahead and duplicate this and call this left eye. And now let's lock our effect control window. And then let's come back into our head comp here. And let's select each of our eye control nulls here. And let's zero out their position values as well. This time, of course, using the add 0 script in Duic, so they maintain their position. Now, just like we did with our shoulder controls earlier, we can grab the property pick whip or the expression pick whip if you're using an older version of After Effects, and just connect these to the point control. So left eye to the left eye point control, right eye to the right eye point control. And now we have individual control over each pupil. And what's cool about this is even with the individual control, our eye aim controller still works. So we haven't broken anything. We can have the eyes crossed or crazy Google eyes, and they'll still be able to be aimed with the main eye aim control. Now the next thing we want to do with these eyes is add some blink control. Blinking is really a must-have for any character rig, especially if your character is actually not going to be doing that much animation. If the animation is going to be somewhat limited, a character can stand absolutely still with no movement at all, and with just a couple of eye blinks, the character will still appear to be alive. Besides that, being able to blink eyes or half blink eyes is an important part of giving your character a full range of facial expressions. Now in the next lesson, we're going to look at actually creating animated eyelids that open and close over the eyes. And you can certainly do that with these kind of simple button eyes. And once you learn that technique in the next lesson, you can certainly apply that to these type of eyes. But I like to use a slightly different technique for button or dot eyes that creates a really nice blink effect, also gives you some additional expressive capability with the eyes, and it's very easy to rig up, especially with Duick's awesome connector tool. And now you're going to see why we put those anchor points where we did on these eyes. So what we're going to do, rather than rig up eyelids that open and close over the eyes, is we're going to actually squash and stretch the eyes to create a blink effect. Now, it's a common practice in classical character animation to have the eyes squash a little bit as the lids close, especially with very cartoony characters, and to have them stretch a little bit when the eyes pop open. With a character with dot or button eyes, if we squash the eye enough, it essentially turns into a little slit which looks like a closed eye. Plus, it also gives that sort of nice squashy, stretchy effect on the eyes, which makes them feel sort of soft and rubbery and cartoony. It also gives us the option to stretch the eye on the other side and make the eyes appear sort of surprised, so they can sort of pop in surprise. So it's a very nice, effective, expressive control, and it's very easy to rig. So let's start in our rig comp here with our eye controller selected, and let's add some slider controls. So I'm going to go up under Effect, Expression Controls, and I'm going to add a slider control, and we'll call this slider Blink. I'm going to move this blink controller up above our individual eye point controls because these will be used somewhat rarely. The blink control you're going to use all the time. Now let's right-click on this slider value, choose Edit Value, and let's change the range of the slider to -100 to 100. So our neutral is 0 right in the middle. Then let's select our eye layer in the timeline, hit the E key to open all the effects on that layer, and we'll tab open our new blink slider so we can select that slider when we're ready to use our connector tool. Now let's come back to our head pre-comp here. Let's zoom in a little bit, and let's start with the left eye here, and we're going to select the left eye null controller we created, and we're going to hit the S key for scale. Now note that the scale property is locked with an expression. That's because Duick automatically locks scale on all of its controllers, which is a really good thing because you don't want to be trying to click and drag on a controller and accidentally scale it rather than move its position. So this is a very, very good thing that Duick does. In this particular case, we want to remove this expression. So I've tabbed open the expression tab here. You can see that we just have the 100% scale values typed in that locks this scale at that value. So I'm just going to select that and delete it. And that will now return our scale to being fully animatable. Now let's jump in 10 frames, and we'll zoom in here a little bit on the timeline. And we're going to start by adding a keyframe with the scale at 100 and 100% in X and Y. Now what we want to do is create a little sequence of animation of the eye squashing at frame 0 and stretching at frame 20. If you remember, when we created the opening and closing animation on the hand, we did that the same way, so that neutral is in the middle at 10, and the animation we want when we slide the slider down to -100 is at 0, and the animation we want when we slide up to 100 is at 20. We want to make sure that that neutral value is in the middle of those two other keyframes. So let's go down to frame 0 here. Let's uncheck Constrain Proportions, and let's create a squash pose. Now the most important thing about squash and stretch, if you remember your 12 principles of animation, is that we always want to maintain the volume of the object if it's squashing or stretching. So whatever value we add to X, we have to subtract from Y. So for example, if we make X 150%, we need to make Y 50%. So we've added 50 to X, so we have to subtract 50 from Y. And then we have the same volume of the shape even as it's squashing. Now that's working pretty good, but it's not quite all the way to the point of this eye feeling closed. So let's go a little farther. Let's go 175 and 25. There we go. Now that eye actually looks closed. It looks like a little slit, like the eyelids have come together, and we can just see that little line indicating the two eyelids pressed together. Now what we also get is this nice kind of rubbery sense, and you can see as I open and close that, it does read as a blink, even though it's squashing and stretching. And this is why we put this anchor point at the lower part. Now, why did we do that? And why is that important to making a blink feel correct? If you look in a mirror and then wink with one eye so you can see what that eye is doing with your other eye, you'll note that your upper eyelid is doing the vast bulk of the work in a wink or a blink. The lower eyelid barely moves at all. It comes up a little bit to meet the upper eyelid, but very, very little. So in creating this squash and stretch sort of fake blink, we're simulating that by putting the anchor point low on the eye, so there's much more movement in what would be the upper lid as compared with the lower lid. The lower part of the eye just moves up a little bit. The upper part of the eye comes down a lot. Now, the other reason we're doing this is when we stretch the eye, which we're going to do in a minute here, it's sort of simulating raising the eyebrows and kind of opening the eyes real wide. And again, that's lifting from the top rather than from the lower lid down. And most of the movement is going to be happening in the upper part of the eye. So let's now go to frame 20 and create our stretch pose. Now, we don't need to have it stretch as much as it squashes, because the stretch is really going to be just this sense of kind of surprise rather than a sense of the eye actually closing, which we wanted on the other end. So here I think the 150-50 reversed will work pretty good. So let's put 50% in X and 150 in Y, and that's probably as stretched as we would ever want to go with this eye. Now, if you want to go farther, you certainly can do that. It's entirely up to you how do you set up your own animation, but you get the idea. So now we have the squash down to blink and the stretch for surprise on either side of the neutral here in the middle at frame 10. Okay, now that we've got a squash and stretch on this eye that we like, let's go to the right eye, hit the S key, again tab open that expression, select it and delete it. So we go back to an animatable property. Let's grab our keyframes here that we've created for the left eye. Let's copy those and let's paste those into the right eye. So now the right and left eye have the same squash and stretch animation. Now we just need to use our connector to tie this all together. So let's go into our connector tool. Let's select our slider here in the timeline in our main rig comp. And we will choose Pick Master Property to select that slider as our master property. We want our minimum value to be -100 to 100 at maximum to reflect our slider values here. And then we just need to select the animation here in our head comp, and under Select Children, choose Connect to Properties. Notice that the eyes popped back into their neutral immediately because our slider is at its neutral value. So now if we go to our eye control and we slide down, our eyes close, and if we slide all the way up, we get this little sort of surprised look. And at 0, of course, we have our eyes at neutral. So now we have a really effective blink just from 0 to 100 and back to 0. And we can even have sort of like half-lidded, sort of sleepy eyes, or we can have our eyes pop open with surprise, settle back to their neutral position. So a really nice, simple blink control for the eyes. It's not really technically a blink. It's really a squash and stretch control, but it works as a blink control. And again, pretty easy to set up. Now, this is awesome to be able to blink our eyes and to be able to move our eyes around with our aim control and even control the individual position of each eye. But there's one thing we're missing here, which is the ability to wink. In other words, to open and close just one eye, or have one eye be sleepy and half-lidded and the other eye be open if a character is, again, like punch drunk or something. Well, that's exactly why we started by parenting the eye artwork to these nulls rather than working directly with the eye artwork. This will now allow us to add individual blink or wink control to each eye so that we can blink both eyes together, which you're going to do a lot when a character is just standing and blinking. But if you need to, you can also have your character wink. And we're going to use exactly the same process we just did, just with each individual piece of eye artwork. So let's start with our effects controls. Let's select our blink control and let's duplicate it twice. And let's change the name of one to right wink and the other to left wink. We'll tab both of these open in our timeline. And then let's go back into our head comp and let's select the left and right eye artwork layers. Hit the S key for scale. Now, unfortunately, we can't copy and paste the keyframes we already created because it'll also copy and paste the expression code. So we just need to quickly recreate the animation we created before. And this will be easy because we already know the values we need here. So 175 and 25 here at frame 0, 100 and 100 at frame 10, and 50 and 150 at frame 20. So we've just recreated that same animation on the eye layers themselves. Now let's start with the right wink slider here. I'm going to select that slider. I'm going to come to our connector and choose that as the master property. And you'll know that you've selected it when the minimum value drops back to 0. So pay close attention to that because this simply says slider. It doesn't tell you which slider. Then we can change the minimum value again to -100. We're going to select the right eye animation and connect to properties. And again, that eye pops back to its neutral just like we would hope it would. Let's now grab the left wink slider here. Again, we're going to choose that as our master property. Make sure that your minimum value has gone back to 0. We're going to set the minimum value at -100 again. We're going to select the left eye animation and connect to properties. So now, if we tab open these sliders here, now we can wink each individual eye, so he can wink, but we can also still blink both eyes together. So let's clean up a little bit here. Let's close all of our tabs and let's lock all of our layers inside our pre-comp here. It's a good idea to lock everything up even if it's within a pre-comp just to be safe. And we can now close that extra timeline window. And let's also make sure we lock our head comp here that we unlocked earlier and shy our layers away. Let's also unlock our effects control window there. We now have a really nice set of controls for these eyes. They can look around, they can wink, they can blink. We can move each individual eye if we need to. So we can really get a very full range of facial expression possibilities with these eyes. Note also that because we parented the eye aim control to the head control, whenever we move the head control, the eye aim control just moves with it, just the way we would want it to. So it's all part of our whole system here. So now that we've learned some of the basics of eye rigging, let's move on to the next lesson and look at some more complicated eyes with eye whites and separate eyelids.